She was 20 years old and for all practical purposes homeless, and the letter that had made her so was folded into quarters in the pocket of her father's old canvas coat. Its edges softened from a week of being read and refolded and read again. Her uncle had written it on the letterhead of Whitlock and Sons Freight, 3 sentences long, informing her that with his son's marriage in September and the new bookkeeper coming down from Sacramento, the household on Bryant Street simply could not accommodate her any longer. A check for $480 was enclosed as a settlement of what he called her share of things. In the other pocket, wrapped in a square of oiled flannel, was her father's brass surveyor's compass. The one he had carried up and down the spine of the Sierra for 19 years before a runaway or cart at the Comstock had taken him at the age of 41, the needle still swung true. The case still smelled faintly of the linseed oil he had rubbed into it every Sunday of her childhood. 2 days after the letter arrived, on a rain-blackened afternoon in the spring of 1897, Eleanor Prewitt walked into the county assessor's office in Reno, Nevada, and spent $312 of that settlement on a piece of property she had never seen, in a town most maps had already forgotten, and what nobody knew, not her uncle. Not the sleepy clerk who sanded the ink on her deed, not even Eleanor herself, not yet, was that the derelict, laughable, absurd thing she had just bought had a room inside it that had been locked for 11 years. And behind the door of that room was a secret that would remake her life and the life of every soul still clinging to that dust-scoured town. So settle in wherever you are tonight, pour yourself something warm, tell me down in the comments what city you're listening from, because this is the story of Eleanor Prewitt, 20 years old, $312 poorer, and the great foolish sun-bleached hulk she came to call the Ambrosia Hotel. Eleanor had been shaped, from the beginning, by 2 worldviews that could not sit at the same table without one of them eventually rising to leave. Her father, Thomas Prewitt, had believed in the elegant logic of a machine, in the way a well-set theodolite could reconcile a mountain to a number, in the honest weight of a plumb bob, in the fact that the earth itself was a puzzle you solved with patience and a steady hand and a good brass instrument you kept clean. Her uncle Marcus, her father's older brother, believed in the ledger book of profit and loss, in columns that balanced, in shipments received, in the moral seriousness of a debt paid on time. Thomas smelled of pipe tobacco and pine sap and the faint metallic tang of the survey chains he carried coiled at his hip. His hands were broad and calloused across the knuckles. And when he set them on Eleanor's shoulders he had a way of squaring her the way he squared a transit, gently, precisely, as though correcting for the drift of the world. He had begun teaching her trigonometry when she was 9 and how to shoot a bearing when she was 11. And by the time she was 14 she could read a topographic map the way other girls her age read the society pages. The day he died, a Tuesday, the 2nd of October, 1891, a foreman from the Comstock rode down to the boarding house himself to bring her the compass, still warm from her father's pocket, and a note her father had scribbled that morning on the back of a triangulation chart. Eleanor, it read, the needle will always tell you which way is true. The rest is arithmetic and courage. She was 14 years old and she folded the note into the compass case and did not cry until 3 days later, alone, in the pantry, with the door shut. Her mother she remembered only in fragments, the smell of bergamot in a warm neck, the weight of a hand smoothing hair back from a fevered forehead, for Adelaide Prewitt had died of scarlet fever when Eleanor was 5, and what remained of her was less a person than an atmosphere. A hush in the house that had never quite lifted. When Thomas was killed, there was nowhere for a 14-year-old girl to go but to Uncle Marcus's tall narrow house on Bryant Street in Reno, where she was received not with cruelty. Marcus was not cruel, only careful, but with the quiet, weighing attention with which he received a new shipment of dry goods. He gave her a room at the back of the 2nd floor, a set of chores itemized on a card tacked inside the pantry door, and an allowance of 30 cents a week which he expected her to account for. By day Eleanor kept her uncle's books, learned the freight tariffs of the Central Pacific by heart, and could tell you within a nickel what a hundredweight of flour should cost delivered to Winnemucca in February. But at night, by the yellow light of a kerosene lamp she trimmed low so as not to waste oil. She pulled out her father's field notebooks and taught herself the parts he had not lived to teach her, the geometry of level runs, the calculation of azimuth from the pole star, the names and uses of every screw and vernier on the compass in her drawer. She lived, without ever quite saying so to anyone, in two countries at once, her uncle's country of ledgers, and her father's country of maps. The dismissal, when it came, was not cruel either, only cold in the way weather is cold. Uncle Marcus called her into the front office on a Thursday morning in April of 1897, and he did not sit her down. He stood on his own side of the walnut desk with the ledger open before him and did not quite meet her eyes as he spoke, his gaze fixed instead on a smudge of ink near the desk's edge. "Eleanor," he said, "Charles is to be married in September, and Miss Hollister will require his rooms, and the new bookkeeper, a Mr. Ainsley from Sacramento, will need the back bedroom for his lodging as part of his terms. It is not a question of affection. It is a question of space and of expense, and I have accounted for both. Your father, God rest him, left no provision for you beyond what I have carried these 6 years, and it is my judgment that you are now of an age to make your own way. I have prepared a settlement of $480, which is generous, and which I have arrived at by a fair accounting of your father's share of our mother's estate and the room and board owed to this household since 1891. He slid the envelope across the desk. Eleanor looked at it, and then at him, and she did not plead. She had learned long ago that pleading was a language he did not speak. "Thank you, uncle," she said, and her voice was steady, and that was all she said. Upstairs, she packed into a single carpetbag 2 dresses, 1 gray wool, 1 blue calico, a nightgown, her father's canvas coat, a Bible her mother had inscribed to her the year before the fever, a small tin of hairpins, 3 of her father's field notebooks bound with twine, and the brass compass in its oiled flannel. On the parlor mantel downstairs stood a row of framed photographs, Marcus and his late wife, Marcus's son Charles at his graduation from the Mercantile Academy. A formal group portrait from the '89 shipping conference, but there was no photograph of Thomas anywhere in the house, and there never had been. And Eleanor did not so much as glance at the mantel as she passed. She closed the front door behind her with both hands so that it would not slam, and stepped down onto Bryant Street with the compass a warm, deliberate weight against her hip, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, one cannot truly lose what one never fully possessed. She rode east on the Central Pacific 2 mornings later in a second-class car crowded with drummers and miners and one Basque sheepherder who slept upright with his hat pulled down. And the dust came in through the seams of the windows and settled in a fine grit on her lips and eyelashes and the pages of the notebook she tried to read. The heat by noon was a solid thing, and the man in the seat behind her chewed tobacco and spat with an accuracy she came to respect. She sat with the carpetbag on her lap and the compass in her palm beneath her folded hands, and she watched the sagebrush flats reel past the window in their endless gray-green undulation. And she thought about her father's maxim, the needle will always tell you which way is true, and she felt the calm of a person who has already survived the worst thing, and knows it. In Reno, on the platform 2 mornings prior, she had picked up a handbill from a stack tied with string outside the assessor's office, Tax Default Properties, Washoe and Humboldt Counties, March 1897. She had read it 3 times on the train. Halfway down the second column, in the smallest type, was a listing that read only, Ambrosia, Nevada. Lot 1, Block 1. Ambrosia Hotel and Appurtenances. Back taxes, $312. Ambrosia. The name of the place sounded like something that had been promised and then withdrawn, like a river that had once run and no longer did. Ambrosia sat 42 miles northeast of the rail spur at Lovelock, and she reached it on the 3rd day. Riding the last leg on the bench of a mail wagon driven by a man named Hollis Doone who chewed sunflower seeds and did not speak for the first 2 hours. The town when it came into view was not so much a town as the memory of one, a wide, sun-bleached main street of perhaps 14 buildings, half of them boarded. A livery with its double doors sagging off their hinges, a general store with a hand-painted sign whose paint had blistered to illegibility, and At the far end of the street where the road bent toward what had once been the Ambrosia River and was now a pale scar of alkali sand, there stood a thing so absurd and so magnificent and so utterly abandoned that Eleanor put her hand to her mouth without meaning to. It was a hotel, 3 stories, mansard roof, painted a color that had once been cream and was now the color of old bone, with a wraparound veranda and a corner tower and a wrought iron cresting along the roofline that had gone the soft brown of rust. It was twice the size of anything else in Ambrosia and 4 times as ambitious, and it stood in that dead street like a debutante in a mining camp. And Eleanor felt something turn over inside her chest and she thought, a forgotten ledger entry. Just like me. Hollis Doone spat sideways and said, without looking at her, that there's the Folly, miss. Nobody's set foot in her in 11 years. Eleanor did not answer. She was already climbing down. The county sub-agent in Ambrosia was a spare, dry-mannered man of about 50 named Elwood Batts, who kept his office in a tin-roofed shed behind the boarded livery and who did not, upon Eleanor's entrance, quite believe what he was seeing. "Miss," he said, "the Ambrosia Hotel is what we call a folly. Silas Cutter built her in '82 on the presumption that the Central Pacific spur was coming up to the river, and it did not, and the river went dry in the winter of '85. And Cutter went bankrupt in the summer of '86, and she has stood empty since. There is no water in that building beyond what you can pump from the back well, which I am told still runs. There is no gas, no telephone, and no prospect of either. The back taxes owing are $312 even, and I will tell you plainly that the county will be pleased to be rid of her. And equally plainly that you will not be pleased to own her." Eleanor counted out the money on his desk, $300 notes, a 10, and 2 silver dollars, which she stacked in a neat column. Batts looked at the stack, and then at her, and he sighed a small dry sigh and said, "Well, God bless the young." He drew the deed from a green tin box, filled in her name in a beautiful copperplate hand, sanded the ink, folded the paper twice, dripped a puddle of red wax at the fold and pressed it with a brass seal that left the county's initials in relief. The paper crackled as he handed it across. "She's yours, Miss Prewitt," he said. "Try not to let her fall on you." The key he gave her was as long as her hand and weighed nearly a quarter-pound. And when she turned it in the front lock of the Ambrosia Hotel that afternoon the tumblers moved with a slow reluctant grinding that she felt in her wrist. The door swung inward on a lobby the size of a barn, ceiling 22 feet overhead, a grand staircase of black walnut curving up to the second landing, and dust everywhere. On the floor in a soft gray blanket a full inch deep, on the abandoned reception desk. On the crystal drops of a chandelier that hung crooked from a rosette in the ceiling like a magnificent dead spider. The air smelled of dry paper and old plaster and the faint mineral cold of a place that has not been warmed by a human body in a decade. She walked room by room, her footprints the first prints in that dust, 42 guest rooms across the second and third floors, a dining room with the tables still laid in a pale ghost cloth of dust. A kitchen with a black iron ranged the size of a wagon and a pantry lined in fur shelves, a billiard room with its slate table intact under a canvas shroud, and, at the back, down a set of narrow service stairs, a cellar that housed the mechanical heart of the building, a coal-fired boiler, a bank of copper pipes, a cast-iron pump connected to the back well. She laid her palm on the boiler's flank. She had learned enough from her father, and enough more from 3 years of freight manifests describing exactly this kind of machinery, to know what she was looking at. The plates were sound. The pipes had been drained before abandonment, she could see the careful stopcocks, and the pump handle, when she leaned into it, gave a dry cough and then, on the 4th stroke, brought up a thin trickle of cold clear water that smelled of iron and stone. Fundamentally sound, she thought, in her father's exact voice. A home waiting to be awakened. She chose for herself, that first night, a small housekeeper's room off the kitchen, because it was the easiest to warm and the closest to the well. And for the first 2 weeks of May 1897 her days took on the shape of small, precise, methodical victories. On the first day she swept the housekeeper's room and the kitchen, and the dust rose in such clouds that she tied a dishcloth over her mouth and worked until her arms shook. On the second day she washed the kitchen floor with well water and a bar of yellow lye soap she had bought at the general store for 11 cents. On the third day she pried the boards off the housekeeper's room window and washed the glass on both sides. And the afternoon light came in for the first time in 11 years and lay on the scrubbed floor in a warm honey rectangle, and she stood in it for a full minute without moving. On the fourth day she coaxed the kitchen range to life with kindling split from a broken chair, and she boiled well water and made a cup of tea from a paper twist of leaves she had carried from Reno. And she drank it sitting on an overturned crate in the doorway with the sun going down over the empty river, and she thought, "This is a small pocket of civilization, and I have made it." She rationed her lamp oil at 2 ounces an evening. She rationed her flour by the cup. She wrote everything in a ledger, not her uncle's kind, but her own, and she watched her $480, less the $312 for the deed, less the small outlays for soap and flour and oil, hold steady at $149 and change, and she thought that if she was careful, and if nothing collapsed, she could make it last through the summer. It was on the 11th day, working her way along the second-floor corridor with a broom and a bucket, that she came to the door of room 14 and found that it would not open. Every other door on that floor had opened either freely or with a shove, this one did not move at all. There was no key in the housekeeper's board downstairs marked for it, every other hook bore its brass tag, but the hook for 14 was empty. She knelt and put her eye to the keyhole and saw only darkness. She thought, first, of her father, who had taught her, half in play, half because he believed a person should be able to open any door they encountered, how to pick a simple pin tumbler lock with 2 bent pieces of wire. She fetched 2 hairpins from her tin, straightened one and bent the other, and she worked at the lock for the better part of an hour, kneeling on the boards with the afternoon sun sliding across her back, and she could feel the pins inside the cylinder and she could feel that they were not, in fact, the problem. The problem was that the lock had been packed with something, wax perhaps, or lead, poured into the mechanism from the inside so that no key would ever turn it again. She sat back on her heels and considered. She considered the door itself then, and she saw what she should have seen at once, the hinges were on her side. Whoever had sealed the room had sealed it against a key, but not against a screwdriver in time. She fetched her father's small brass-handled screwdriver from the compass roll, he had carried it for adjusting his instruments and it had come to her in the same package as the compass, and she began, on the morning of the 12th day, to unscrew the 3 brass hinges of room 14 from the jamb. The screws had rusted into their threads and the slots were half-eaten, and she worked at them for the better part of 2 days, wrapping her raw knuckles in strips torn from an old flour sack, driving the screwdriver with a wooden mallet when her wrist would not turn any longer. On the afternoon of the 14th day the last screw gave, and the door tipped outward toward her, and she caught it against her shoulder and lowered it to the corridor floor. A breath of air came out of that room, dry and stale and cold, and it smelled of tobacco and old ink and the faint sweet dust of dried flowers that had once stood in a vase and had long since crumbled to nothing. She stepped over the threshold. The room was an office, not a guest room, a partner's desk of dark oak beneath the window, a leather-bound armchair with the leather cracked into a map of tiny continents, a wall of ledger books along the north wall behind glass, a hat rack with a black felt bowler still hanging from its hook, a decanter on a side table with an inch of something dark and dry crystallized in the bottom. On the desk lay an open logbook, a pen laid neatly across the page as though the writer had just set it down, and a small tintype in an oval brass frame, a woman and 2 children, a boy and a girl, all 3 formally posed and unsmiling in the manner of the time. Eleanor picked up the logbook. The hand was small and clipped and precise, and the entries were dated April 3, 1886. River down again. Bed cracked to the bone at the second bend. Prayed. Not answered. April 17, 1886. Central Pacific engineer confirms spur will go by way of Winnemucca. Ambrosia not in the survey. We are undone. May 22, 1886. Sold the piano to a gentleman from Elko for $40. He looked at me the way one looks at the bereaved. June 9, 1886. Margaret and the little ones on the eastbound. She wept. I did not. July 30, 1886. Last guest checked out this morning, a Mr. Callahan of the Wells Fargo, who paid in full and shook my hand. Building empty tonight. Every room. I sat in the lobby until dark. And then, in a hand grown suddenly larger and less steady, the final entry, August 14, 1886. I have done what I can. I have set aside what I could not bring myself to spend, against the possibility of a future I will not see. Whoever finds this, the Ambrosia was not a folly. It was a promise made to a river that broke faith. Silas Cutter, Proprietor. Eleanor sat down in the cracked leather chair and read the entries twice through, and the late afternoon light moved from the desk to the floor to the wall, and she did not move with it. When at last she stood up, it was to walk slowly around the room the way her father had taught her to walk around a piece of ground you meant to survey, looking not for what was there, but for what was not quite consistent. She found it on the third pass. The wainscoting on the east wall, behind the desk, was made of vertical fir planks each about 6 inches wide, and every plank matched its neighbor in grain and color except for one. The fourth from the corner, whose grain ran the opposite direction and whose color was a shade paler. She knelt and tapped along the wainscot with her knuckle, solid, 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 and then, at the fourth plank, a hollow that answered her knock like a small drum. She pressed the top of the plank, nothing. She pressed the bottom, nothing. She slid her fingernails along its right edge and felt a small notch, no bigger than a pea, cut into the underside. She hooked her nail in it and pulled. And the plank swung outward on a hidden pivot with the small satisfied click of a well-made piece of joinery. Behind the plank was a cavity about a foot square, and in the cavity were 3 things: a canvas bag tied with a leather thong, a small wooden box no bigger than a deck of cards, and an envelope of heavy cream paper addressed in the same clipped hand as the logbook, to whomever finds this. Eleanor lifted the canvas bag first, and by its weight she knew before she opened it. Inside were gold coins, double eagles, $20 pieces, minted in San Francisco, each one wrapped in a small square of tissue, and when she counted them, sitting cross-legged on the office floor with the coins in stacks of 10 around her knees, there were 160 of them. $3,200 in gold. She sat for a long time with her hands flat on the boards, and then she opened the small wooden box. Inside, on a bed of faded blue velvet, lay a silver pocket watch on a fine chain, its case engraved with the initials SC, its face still bright behind the crystal. The hand stopped at 4:17. She lifted the watch out and pressed the stem, and after 11 years of stillness the second hand gave a small tentative shudder and then, with a sound so faint she had to hold her breath to hear it, began to tick. She laid the watch on the desk beside the logbook. Then she opened the letter. To whomever finds this, it began, in Silas Cutter's small precise hand. My name was Silas Cutter and I built the Ambrosia Hotel in the year 1882 in the town of Ambrosia, Nevada, on the promise of a river and a railroad. And both promises were broken before I could pay off the mortgage. I was born in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in 1834, and I came west in 1861 as a young man of 27 with a wife and a hope and very little else. My wife Margaret bore me 2 children, Thomas and Eliza, and in the winter of 1885 all 3 of them took the diphtheria within a week of one another, and by the 7th of February I was alone. I stayed on in Ambrosia because I could not think what else to do, and because leaving felt like a second burial. I have used every dollar of profit this hotel ever made to pay its debts and to bury my dead, save for the sum you have found, which I could not bring myself to spend. Call it superstition. I came to think of it as seed, set aside against a season I would not live to see. If you are reading this, then a season has come. I bequeath what is here to you, whoever you are. On the single condition that you have had the patience to open this room and the vision to find value in a thing that every other soul in this country abandoned. Do with it what seems good to you. My watch I leave as well, it kept faithful time through every year of my grief, and I ask only that you wind it now and again, and think, when you do, of a man who once believed in this place. S.E., August 14, 1886. Eleanor set the letter down on the desk, and she reached into her pocket and unwrapped the flannel and set her father's brass compass beside Silas Cutter's silver watch. And she sat looking at the two objects side by side in the failing light. The compass had been a guide to true north through a country that had never once been kind to the man who carried it. The watch had been a keeper of faith through 11 years of an empty house. One was a guide to what was true, she thought, and the other a reminder of what endures. She did not weep, though she felt she might have been permitted to. Instead she took up Silas Cutter's pen, which was still lying across the logbook. And on the first blank page after his last entry she wrote, in her own careful hand, May 26, 1897. Eleanor Prewitt, of Reno, Nevada, age 20, took possession of this hotel by deed of tax sale for $312 on the 8th day of May. Found this office and this letter this afternoon. I mean to stay. I mean to use what has been left me not to escape this place but to answer it. Then she closed the logbook, and she wound the watch, and she went downstairs to make her supper. She spent the first week of June thinking, not spending. She walked the length of the dry Ambrosia River bed and back. She rode Hollis Dune's mail wagon into Lovelock and sat 2 full days at a corner table in the railroad cafe listening to the drummers and the freight agents and the men who moved cattle up to the Oregon markets. And she learned that the road she had come in on, the old Ambrosia Road, was still the shortest route by 12 miles between the rail spur at Lovelock and the silver camps in the Jackson Range to the northeast. And that upwards of 40 riders and wagons a week used it in the season, and that not one of them had a decent bed or a hot supper between Lovelock and the camps, a full day and a half's ride. She rode back to Ambrosia with a notebook full of numbers and a plan taking shape in her head. And by the time she climbed down from the mail wagon in front of the Folly she knew what she was going to do. The Ambrosia would be 2 things at once, because a single-purpose building in a country this thin could not survive. It would be a lodging house for travelers on the Lovelock, Jackson Road. With hot suppers and cold beer and a bed for $1 a night, and it would also be, in the old livery bay attached to the north side. A repair shop and a wheelwright's and a small mercantile of the sorts of things a traveler on that road most often needed and most often broke, an axle bolt, a wagon tongue, a canteen strap. A pound of nails, a keg of grease. She would run the lodging herself. For the shop she would need help. For lumber and glass and hardware she rode to Lovelock a second time, in the 3rd week of June. And she came back on a hired flatbed wagon with a load that made the whole of Ambrosia's main street come out onto its porches to look, 240 board feet of pine. 16 panes of window glass wrapped in straw, 40 pounds of 10-penny nails, a keg of white lead paint and a keg of red oxide, a coil of stovepipe, for new brass door hinges. And a small crate of tools she had chosen herself off the shelf at Weiss & Sons, a jack plane, a brace and bits, a level, a mallet. And a small silver-plated tri-square she bought as a private extravagance because it reminded her of her father. Elwood Batts came out of his tin-roofed shed to watch her unload, and he said, dryly, Miss Prewitt, I am beginning to suspect I have misjudged your intentions. You have, Mr. Batts, she said, and she did not look up from her nails, and Elwood Batts laughed, a short surprised bark of a laugh, which was, she would later realize, the first laugh she had heard in Ambrosia at all. She began with the roof, because her father had taught her that a house that leaks upward will rot from every direction at once. She hired, on Batts's recommendation, an older man from the north edge of town named Ezra Millwood who had been a shipwright in Bath, Maine, before the war and a carpenter in Nevada afterward. And who lived alone in a 2-room adobe with a cat and a great many unfinished projects. Ezra came to look at the Ambrosia on a Monday morning, and he walked the roofline slowly with his hands in his pockets and said nothing for a full half-hour. And then he came down and stood in front of Eleanor and said, "You know what you're about, girl?" She said, "My father was a surveyor for the Comstock. He built 2 of his own houses. He is dead. I know what I am about." Ezra looked at her for a long moment, and then he took a piece of chalk from his pocket and made a small mark on the corner of the veranda post, and he said, "Match that mark on the far post by tomorrow noon and I'll work with you." It was a plumb line problem. And Eleanor set it and marked it in 11 minutes with her father's compass and a length of string weighted with a nail. And Ezra came back the next morning with his tool chest on a handcart and did not mention the test again. Together they reshingled the west face of the mansard in the last 2 weeks of June, and Ezra taught her the trick of the doubled starter course. And she taught him, because he confessed one afternoon that he had never quite understood it, the arithmetic of the hip roof's cheek cut, which her father had explained to her once, in chalk. On the side of a boarding house wall. The second person who came was a woman named Odessa Vane, who kept a small kitchen behind the boarded general store and sold bread and pies out of her back window to whoever knew to ask. Odessa was 52 years old. A black woman who had come to Ambrosia with her husband in '81 to run the hotel kitchen for Silas Cutter and had stayed on after her husband's death from pneumonia in '89 because, as she put it, "The desert was hard, but it had not yet lied to me." She began, without asking and without being asked, to leave a loaf of bread and a small dish of preserves on the veranda step every second morning, wrapped in a clean flour sack. Eleanor found the first one on the 14th of June, and she carried it to Odessa's back window that afternoon and asked what she owed. Odessa said, "You owe me a job when you open, Miss Prewitt, and not a nickel before." Eleanor said, "Done." They shook hands through the window. The third was a man named Jubal Reyes, blacksmith, 40 years old, whose forge stood at the south end of the main street and who had held the town together in small iron ways for the better part of a decade, a hinge here, a wheel rim there. A horseshoe on credit for a man he knew would pay him in the fall. Jubal came to the Ambrosia in the first week of July, uninvited, walked into the livery bay Eleanor was clearing for her repair shop, and stood looking at the old anvil bolted to a stump in the corner. "That anvil," he said, "was Chester Prewitt's, out of the Comstock. Same maker as mine. See the mark?" Eleanor came and looked, and there in the corner of the anvil's flank was the small stamped seal, P. Wyatt and C.O., Hartford, that she had last seen on her father's own field theodolite. She did not know how to speak for a moment. Jubal said, "Your daddy." She said, "My uncle, maybe. My father knew the mark." Jubal nodded once and said, "Man knew good iron. I'll rebuild your forge for you if you'll let me use it 2 days a week for my own work." Eleanor said, "Done." They did not shake hands, Jubal only nodded again, and walked out. And came back at sunrise the next morning with a hammer. They were not friends, Eleanor came to understand, not in the way the word was used in the story papers, with confidences and pet names and long evening walks. They were something older and stronger than that in a country as thin as this one. They were people whose work had become entangled, whose competencies fit together, whose small kindnesses were exchanged without ledger but without confusion about what was owed. Ezra taught her how to caulk a window against a sandstorm with oakum and tar. Odessa taught her which of the town's 3 wells ran sweetest in July and which turned brackish in August, and how to bake bread at Ambrosia's altitude without letting the crust go leathery. Jubal taught her, because she asked, how to draw a horseshoe nail down to a taper on the forge, and she taught him, in return, how to set a level to within a 64th of an inch on a warped beam, which he said was a witch's trick and would not use, and then, 3 weeks later, used, and did not mention it. Months turned into a year and then a little more. By the autumn of 1898 the Ambrosia Hotel, which Eleanor had renamed, on a new sign painted in red oxide and white by Ezra Millwood's own hand. The Ambrosia House and Wayside, stood on the main street of Ambrosia, Nevada, as though it had been dropped there fresh from a better world. The mansard roof was tight and true. The veranda was painted the color of good cream and the shutters the color of a dark river stone. 16 of the 42 guest rooms were open and let, at $1 a night, with a hot supper included for another 20 cents, the rest were closed off behind a velvet rope on the second landing. Awaiting a season with more travelers than Eleanor yet had. The old livery bay was Jubal's forge 2 days a week and Eleanor's repair shop and mercantile the other 5, and above its door hung a smaller sign that read simply the wayside, wheelwright, farrier. Dry goods. The kitchen at the back was Odessa's kingdom entirely, and the smell of her sourdough at 4 in the morning reached as far as Elwood Bats's shed, and Bats, who now took his breakfast on the veranda every day at 7, had been heard to say that it was the finest advertisement any hotel in Nevada had ever posted. Her first paying guest had been a cattle buyer from Winnemucca, on the 6th of October, 1897. Who had paid $1.20 and left the next morning saying he had slept better than he had in his own house. Her 10th had been a Mormon apostle bound for the Jackson camps who had asked, gravely, whether she permitted the reading of scripture at the supper table, and had. Upon being told that she permitted her guests any decency they cared to bring, blessed the house on his way out. Her 40th had been a woman traveling alone, a schoolteacher named Miss Ives, bound for a posting in Paradise Valley, who had wept quietly in the parlor upon being handed her room key by another woman, and had left a note in the ledger the next morning that read only, "Thank you." The town had begun to call Eleanor, without any vote or announcement, Miss Prewitt of the Ambrosia, and by the winter of 1898 the shortened form, Miss Prewitt, had come to mean. In Ambrosia and on the 50 miles of road on either side of it, one specific young woman, and no other. A day at the Ambrosia house by the autumn of 1899 looked like this. Eleanor rose at 4:30 and lit the kitchen range from the banked coals of the night before. And by 5 Odessa Vane came in through the back door with her apron already tied and her sleeves already pushed to the elbow. And the two of them made bread and coffee and cut bacon for the morning's guests without needing to speak more than 8 or 10 sentences to each other, most of them about weather. At 6 Ezra Millwood came up the veranda steps with his tool roll under his arm to do the day's small repairs, a sticking window, a loose baluster, a hinge in need of oil, and he took his coffee standing at the kitchen door and gave Eleanor his list of what he would need from Lovelock that week. At 7 the guests came down. At 8 Jubal Reyes fired his forge in the livery bay, and the ringing of his hammer became, as the year went on, one of the town's small settled sounds. Like a church bell in a country that had no church. At noon Eleanor kept the shop, and travelers came in off the road for a length of chain or a tin of axle grease or a pound of nails, and she wrote each sale in a small green ledger on the counter. And the ledger balanced every night to the penny. In the afternoons she taught, when she had a pupil, Ezra's grandnephew Willem, who was 11 and had a good eye, Jubal's daughter Seraphina, who was 14 and had better, and once, for a whole summer, a Paiute boy named Charlie whose father brought him down from the Jackson foothills every Wednesday, how to read a topographical map, how to shoot a bearing with the brass compass, how to lay out a right angle on the ground with 3 lengths of rope in the ratio 3:4:5. Her father's field notebooks lay open on the parlor table for anyone who wanted to look. The Ambrosia had become, without anyone having decided it should, the social and economic heart of the town. The place mail was left, the place travelers stopped. The place a rancher's wife came to have a tooth pulled by the visiting dentist who now made Ambrosia a monthly stop. The place the 4th of July supper was held in 1899 and 1900 and every year thereafter for as long as anyone alive would remember. On a quiet evening in November of 1901, 4.5 years after she had first turned the long brass key in the lobby door, Eleanor climbed the stairs to what had once been room 14 and was now her private office. The velvet chair had been re-leathered by a saddler in Lovelock in the spring of 1899. The ledger books on the north wall now included her own, 6 of them, one for each year, bound in dark green cloth with the year stamped in gilt on the spine. The wainscoting had been left exactly as she had found it, false plank and all. And behind the false plank she now kept the deed to the Ambrosia and Silas Cutter's letter and her father's parting note in a small tin box of her own. On the desk, side by side beneath the green shade of the reading lamp, lay two objects. The first was her father's brass surveyor's compass, its needle still swinging true, its case still smelling faintly of linseed oil after all these years. The second was Silas Cutter's silver pocket watch, wound that morning as it was every morning, ticking softly in the quiet of the room. One had been given to me to show me which way was true, she thought, and the other to remind me what it costs to keep faith. She sat for a while looking at the two of them together on the blotter, and then she thought, as she sometimes did on quiet evenings, of her Uncle Marcus. Sitting in his tall narrow house on Bryant Street in Reno, doing his sums. She had written to him in the autumn of 1898, a short cordial letter announcing that she was well and settled in the town of Ambrosia, and she had received in reply, 4 weeks later, a note of 2 sentences, the second of which wished her good fortune. She bore him no ill will now, and had not for a long time. He had done, according to the arithmetic of his own worldview, what he had believed to be a fair and generous thing. That his ledger had failed to contain a column for a girl and a compass and a river that had once run was not, in the end, his fault. He could not have imagined the Ambrosia house. He could not have imagined the silver watch, or Odessa's bread, or the ringing of Jubal's hammer. Or the small satisfying weight of a green ledger closed for the night on a day that balanced to the penny. It was not the country he lived in. She wished him, in the quiet of that November evening, an honest peace within it. Her name was Eleanor Prewitt. She had been 20 years old, in the spring of 1897. When a folded letter and a settlement of $480 had put her out onto Bryant Street with a carpetbag and a brass compass and the clear cold understanding that the household in which she had lived for 6 years had never quite counted her among its members. She had spent $312 of that settlement on the deed to a derelict hotel in a town that no map printed after 1886 bothered to name. It was the best $312 she ever spent. It had bought her more than a home, it had bought her a life.